The rope tightened around Elijah Freeman's neck as he stood on the back of a wagon, his hands bound behind him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Redemption Creek, illuminating the faces of 30 angry white men who had gathered to watch justice delivered frontier style. But as the lynch mob leader prepared to whip the horses forward, the distinct sound of a shotgun being cocked cut through the crowd's murmurs. "Touch those horses, and I'll put both barrels through your chest," called out a steady female voice. Sarah Calloway, widow of the county's former judge, stood at the edge of the gathering, her shotgun unwavering as she stepped forward to face down the entire mob. But 24 hours earlier, neither Sarah nor Elijah had any idea that their paths would cross in a moment that would challenge everything their small Texas town believed about justice, courage, and the worth of a man's life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1887, and Redemption Creek, Texas, was a town balanced on the knife edge between the old frontier ways and the promise of a more civilized future. The railroad had arrived 5 years earlier, bringing with it new opportunities, new settlers, and new tensions as the once isolated community found itself connected to the wider world. Sarah Calloway's farm sat on the outskirts of town, a modest but well-maintained spread of 120 acres that she had managed alone since her husband Thomas died of pneumonia 3 winters past. The widow Calloway, as townspeople called her, was respected but also viewed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A woman who insisted on running her own affairs without remarrying was something of an oddity in these parts. On this particular evening, Sarah was mending a fence on the western edge of her property, her hands roughened by years of work that would have broken many women of her upbringing. The daughter of a Virginia banker, she had been raised with certain expectations about a lady's place in society. But Thomas had seen something different in her, a strength and practical intelligence that had made them true partners in building their Texas home. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her straighten, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Riders coming from the direction of town usually meant news, and in Sarah's experience, rarely good news. As the horse and rider came into view, Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward the shotgun she kept nearby when working the far reaches of her property. Texas was safer than in the early days, but a woman alone still needed to be cautious. The rider slowed as he approached, and Sarah recognized Edward Mitchell, the town's young telegraph operator. "Evening, Mrs. Calloway," he called, tipping his hat respectfully. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you all the way out here at this hour?" The young man seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his saddle. "Message came through from Austin this morning. Thought you should know on account of the judge and all." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest whenever Thomas was mentioned. "What sort of message, Mr. Mitchell?" "There's a black man being brought in tomorrow, accused of murdering a rancher over in Willow Springs." Mitchell twisted his hat in his hands. "Sheriff Daniels is bringing him in to stand trial here since we've got the new courthouse. But there's talk in town." "What kind of talk?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Some folks are saying why bother with a trial at all. Hank Crawford's already organizing some of the men. Says they'll deliver frontier justice as soon as the prisoner arrives." Mitchell looked genuinely troubled. Judge Calloway wouldn't have stood for such talk. He believed in the law. "Yes, he did," Sarah said quietly, her mind already racing through the implications. Thomas had been known throughout the county as a fair judge, one who insisted that every man, regardless of color, deserved a proper trial. It had made him both respected and resented, depending on who you asked. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Mitchell. I appreciate you writing all this way." The young man nodded, clearly relieved to have delivered his message. "Evening, Mrs. Calloway. I should get back before dark." He turned his horse and rode toward town, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the unfinished fence. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee before her, and Thomas's old law books spread open across the wooden surface. In the years since his death, she had often found herself poring over these volumes, seeking connections to the man she had lost and perhaps some understanding of the principles that had guided him. Thomas had been unlike most men of his generation. The son of abolitionists from Pennsylvania, he had come to Texas after the war with ideals about equality and justice that many of his neighbors found troubling. The law must protect everyone, or it protects no one, he had often said. It was a philosophy that had made him both a respected jurist and a controversial figure in the community, still wrestling with its place in a changing world. Sarah closed the heavy book before her and stared into the darkness beyond her window. She had no illusions about what frontier justice meant for a black man accused of killing a white rancher. There would be no evidence presented, no witnesses questioned, no chance for the accused to speak in his own defense. There would be only a rope and a tree, or, as was increasingly common in these more civilized times, the back of a wagon driven out from under a man's feet. She thought of writing to the governor, but there wasn't time. By tomorrow evening, it would likely be too late for the man being brought to Redemption Creek. Sarah knew most of the men who would join Hank Crawford's lynch mob: farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands. Ordinary men who, individually, might never consider murder, but who together could convince themselves that hanging a black man without trial was somehow an act of justice, rather than the crime it truly was. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Sarah made her decision. Thomas would have stood against this, using the authority of his position and the power of the law. She had neither, but she had his memory, his principles, and her own stubborn determination not to let Redemption Creek descend into barbarism without at least one voice raised in protest. She dressed with care, choosing her most respectable black dress, the one she wore to church and town meetings. To this, she added a shawl against the morning chill and a wide-brimmed hat that had been fashionable back east several years ago. The overall effect was one of quiet dignity, a woman who might be a schoolteacher or a minister's wife. Only the shotgun, which she loaded and then wrapped carefully in a blanket, suggested that Sarah Calloway's intentions might extend beyond mere moral suasion. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Sheriff Marcus Daniels and his prisoner were already on the road to Redemption Creek. Elijah Freeman sat with his hands shackled, bouncing uncomfortably in the back of the sheriff's wagon as it rolled across the uneven Texas landscape. Elijah was 32 years old, though hard experience had weathered his face to look older. Born into slavery in Mississippi, he had been just a boy when freedom came. His family had traveled west after the war, seeking opportunity and distance from the bitter memories of bondage. For the past 5 years, he had worked as a cowhand for various outfits across central Texas, earning a reputation as an excellent horseman and a man who kept to himself. Now he found himself accused of a murder he hadn't committed, being transported to a town he'd never visited, to face a justice system he had little reason to trust. The rancher, Victor Hammond, had been found dead in his barn, his skull crushed by a shovel. Elijah had been working on a neighboring spread, and had argued publicly with Hammond the day before over the rancher's treatment of a young black stable boy. It had been enough for the local sheriff to arrest him, though the evidence was circumstantial at best. Hammond had enemies throughout the county. He was a hard man known for cheating his workers and threatening his neighbors. But with a black man conveniently at hand, few had been interested in looking for alternative suspects. Sheriff Daniels, for his part, seemed uncomfortable with his assignment. A veteran lawman with 20 years' experience, he had seen enough of life to know that justice wasn't always served by the legal system, particularly when it came to colored folks. But he was a man who believed in procedure, in doing things by the book. His job was to deliver the prisoner for trial, not to Determine guilt or innocence. Water? He asked, passing a canteen back to Elijah during one of their brief stops. Elijah took it with shackled hands. Thank you, Sheriff. He drank deeply, knowing it might be his last chance for a while. Can I ask you something? Daniels nodded, his weathered face impassive. This town we're heading to, what kind of place is it? What kind of judge will I face? The sheriff was quiet for a moment, considering his words. Redemption Creek's like most towns these days, changing, but not always sure in what direction. The judge there died a few years back. New one's from up north somewhere. Don't know him personally. He hesitated, then added, Judge Calloway, the previous one. He had a reputation for fairness. Would have given you a proper hearing, regardless of color. And his replacement? Daniels shrugged. Can't say. But I've heard rumors about some of the men in town. They might not be inclined to wait for a trial. Elijah absorbed this information with the stoic expression of a man who had long ago accepted that the world operated by different rules for people who looked like him. I appreciate your honesty, Sheriff. Don't thank me, Daniels replied gruffly. I'm just doing my job. He took back the canteen and secured it to his belt. We should reach town by mid-afternoon. Try to get some rest. Rest was impossible. Of course. As the wagon rolled onward, Elijah found himself reviewing the events that had led to this moment, searching for what he might have done differently. The argument with Hammond had been a mistake. He should have kept his head down, stayed quiet as he'd been taught since childhood. But something about seeing that boy being whipped for a minor offense had awakened something fierce in him. Something he couldn't contain. And now he was paying the price for that moment of righteous anger. Unless a miracle occurred, Elijah Freeman knew his days on earth were numbered. In Redemption Creek, the news of the prisoner's impending arrival had spread through town like wildfire. By mid-morning, a crowd had begun to gather near the saloon, where Hank Crawford held court among his supporters. Crawford was a successful cattle broker, a man whose wealth gave him influence far beyond his official position in the community. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a carefully trimmed beard going gray at the edges, he cut an imposing figure as he addressed the growing assembly. Gentlemen, he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the street, today we have an opportunity to send a message. When a black man thinks he can murder a white rancher and get away with it, that threatens every one of us. It threatens our wives, our children, our very way of life. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Crawford had a gift for playing on the fears and resentments that simmered beneath the surface of the community. Fears about changing times, about the railroad bringing outsiders with different ideas, about former slaves now competing for jobs and land. The so-called justice system, he continued, practically spitting the words, moves too slowly. Too many technicalities. Too many chances for guilty men to escape punishment. I say we show everyone that in Redemption Creek, we protect our own. More vocal agreement now, men nodding and shouting their support. Crawford smiled, knowing he had them. It was almost too easy. What Crawford didn't see was Sarah Calloway, standing at the edge of the crowd, listening with growing dismay. She had come into town early, hoping to speak with Mayor Wilson about preventing exactly this kind of vigilante action. But the mayor was conveniently out of town on business. According to his secretary, though Sarah suspected, he was simply avoiding having to take a stand on a controversial matter. From her position on the boardwalk, Sarah could see familiar faces in the mob, men who tipped their hats to her on Sundays, who had attended her husband's funeral, who had even sought Thomas's legal advice in years past. Now they were being whipped into a frenzy by Crawford's rhetoric, preparing to commit murder under the guise of justice. She approached one of them, Michael Fletcher, a farmer whose land bordered her own. "Mr. Fletcher," she said quietly, drawing him slightly away from the others. "Do you really intend to be part of this?" Fletcher looked uncomfortable. avoiding her direct gaze. "Mrs. Calloway, with all due respect, this isn't women's business. That Negro killed a white man. There has to be consequences. Has this been proven in court? Has any evidence been presented? Have any witnesses testified?" Sarah pressed, her voice low but intense. "Some things don't need a court to know they're true," Fletcher muttered. "That's not what you said when Thomas ruled in your favor during that boundary dispute with the Miller family," Sarah reminded him. "Then you were quite pleased that the law protected you and your rights." Fletcher's face flushed. "That was different." "How? Because you're white? Is that the only difference that matters?" Sarah felt her temper rising but fought to keep her voice calm and reasonable. "My husband believed that every person deserves equal protection under the law. He would be ashamed to see his neighbors preparing to lynch a man without trial." For a moment, Fletcher seemed to waver, doubt crossing his weathered features. But then Crawford's voice boomed out again, calling the men to action, and the moment passed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway," Fletcher said, turning away. "But times are changing. We have to take a stand." Sarah watched him rejoin the crowd, her heart sinking. If she couldn't even reach Michael Fletcher, a man she had known for years, what chance did she have of stopping this madness? As the morning wore on, Sarah made several more attempts to reason with men she knew, trying to appeal to their better natures, to their respect for the law, even to their Christian principles. A few seemed troubled by her words, but none were willing to stand against Crawford and the mob he was building. By noon, she had retreated to the telegraph office, where young Mitchell was nervously watching the proceedings through his window. "Any word on when the sheriff will arrive with the prisoner?" she asked. Mitchell shook his head. "Nothing official, but Ryder spotted them about 10 miles out. They should be here within a couple of hours." He hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Calloway, you should go home. This isn't going to be. It's not something a lady should witness." Sarah looked at him with such fierce intensity that he took a step back. "Mr. Mitchell, when men abandon justice and embrace murder, it becomes the business of every person with a conscience, lady or otherwise." The young man swallowed hard, but didn't argue further. Sarah left the telegraph office and walked purposefully toward the general store. She had tried reason and moral suasion. Now it was time for her alternative plan. Inside the store, proprietor Walter Graham greeted her with a warm smile that faded when he saw her expression. "Mrs. Calloway, is everything all right?" "I need shells for my shotgun, Mr. Graham, 12 gauge. Graham's eyebrows rose. "Planning on doing some hunting, are you?" "In a manner of speaking," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm hunting for justice in Redemption Creek. I fear it's become an endangered species." Understanding dawned on the storekeeper's face. "Mrs. Calloway, you can't mean to interfere with what's happening today. That would be dangerous. Foolhardy, even." "And yet here we are," she said, placing coins on the counter. "The shells, please." Graham hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Thomas was my friend for 20 years. He'd haunt me till my dying day if I let anything happen to you." He reached beneath the counter and brought out a box of shotgun shells. "But he'd also be the first one standing against this lynch mob if he were here. So I suppose I understand." He pushed the box toward her but kept his hand on it. "Promise me you'll be careful. These men are worked up into a state. They might not stop just because you're a woman." Sarah nodded, appreciating his concern. "I'll be as careful as conscience allows, Mr. Graham, but I won't stand by while a man is murdered without trial. Thomas taught me better than that." Graham released the box, his expression troubled. "Then may God go with you, Mrs. Calloway. I fear you'll need his protection today." With the shotgun shells secured in her pocket, Sarah left the store and made her way to the small law office that had once been her husband's. Now it belonged to the new judge, Harlan Porter, a younger man from Illinois who had taken up the position 18 months ago. The office was empty, Porter was reportedly in Austin on business, but Sarah knew where Thomas had always kept a spare key. Inside, she went directly to the bookshelf where her husband had stored the county legal records. If she was going to make a stand, she wanted to be armed with more than just a shotgun. She needed the law itself. Finding what she sought, a volume containing the Texas State Constitution and legal codes, Sarah tucked it into her bag alongside the shotgun shells. Thomas had often said that the law was the most powerful weapon in a civilized society. Today, she would test that theory with a backup plan of 12-gauge persuasion if necessary. As she left the office, Sarah could see that the crowd around the saloon had grown larger and more restless. Crawford had produced several coils of rope, and men were testing the strength of the oak tree in the town square, a tree that had never been used for hanging before, but seemed destined to begin a grim new chapter in Redemption Creek's history. Sarah's stomach twisted at the sight, but her resolve only strengthened. She made her way to the small church at the edge of town, where she found Pastor William Miller in his study, his Bible open before him and his face lined with worry. "I assume you've seen what's happening in town," she said without preamble. Miller nodded wearily. "I've tried speaking to them, Mrs. Calloway, reminded them of the commandment against murder, of Christ's teachings about mercy and justice. They don't want to hear it. Crawford has their ears and their hearts, God help us. Will you try again?" "When the prisoner arrives." The pastor looked down at his worn Bible. "I will, though I fear it will do little good." Sarah studied him for a moment. "My husband always said you were a man of genuine faith, Pastor Miller. He respected that about you. Thomas was a good man. This town has been poorer without him." Miller looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp with understanding. "What are you planning, Mrs. Calloway?" Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I'm planning to remind Redemption Creek of what my husband stood for. The rule of law, equal justice. Civilization rather than barbarism. That could be dangerous." "So is allowing a mob to murder a man without trial," she countered. "If good people do nothing in the face of injustice, are they truly good?" Miller had no answer for that. After a moment, he simply said, "I'll pray for you, Mrs. Calloway, and for all of us in Redemption Creek today." "Thank you, Pastor," Sarah replied, turning to leave. "I believe we'll need it." As she stepped out of the church, Sarah heard the distant sound of a wagon approaching from the east. Sheriff Daniels and his prisoner had arrived in Redemption Creek. The time for preparation was over. Whatever would happen next would unfold in the harsh light of the Texas afternoon, with consequences that would echo long after the dust had settled. Sarah Calloway gripped her shotgun beneath its blanket wrapping and walked toward the town square, prepared to stand alone if necessary against the tide of hatred and fear that threatened to sweep away everything her husband had believed in. The wagon carrying Sheriff Daniels and Elijah Freeman rolled slowly into Redemption Creek, the horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust in the afternoon heat. From his position in the back, Elijah could see the crowd gathered in the town square, could feel the weight of hostile stares as the wagon approached. His mouth went dry with fear, but he forced himself to sit upright, determined to face whatever came with as much dignity as possible. Sheriff Daniels had also spotted the waiting mob. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his right hand moved closer to his holstered revolver. He had transported prisoners many times in his long career, but something about today felt different, dangerous in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Quite a welcoming committee," he remarked dryly to his deputy, a young man named Collins who rode alongside the wagon. Collins nodded nervously. "What do you want to do, Sheriff?" Daniels considered their options, which were limited. 2 lawmen against what appeared to be 30 or more townsmen, not good odds if things turned ugly. But he had a duty to deliver his prisoner to the proper authorities, not to a lynch mob. "We proceed as planned," he decided. "Head for the jail. Move at a steady pace, not too fast, like we're running, but don't dawdle either." As the wagon neared the town square, Hank Crawford stepped forward, raising his hand in a gesture that was both greeting and command to halt. Behind him, his supporters formed a human barrier across the street, blocking the way to the courthouse and jail. "That's far enough, Sheriff," Crawford called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "We'll take charge of the prisoner from here." Daniels pulled the wagon to a stop but kept a firm grip on the reins. "That's not how the law works, Mr. Crawford. I'm delivering this man to stand trial for his alleged crimes. Please clear the road." Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The law works how the people decide it works, Sheriff. And the people of Redemption Creek have decided this Negro doesn't deserve the time and expense of a trial when his guilt is plain as day." Murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. Several men had moved to surround the wagon, their intentions clear in their stance and expressions. In the back of the wagon, Elijah remained still, his face impassive despite the fear coursing through him. He had known this was a possibility, even a probability, from the moment of his arrest. Black men accused of crimes against whites rarely made it to trial in many parts of Texas. Still, facing his own lynching with such immediacy made his heart pound painfully in his chest. Sheriff Daniels tried again. "I understand your feelings, but this isn't right." "Judge Porter is conveniently absent," Crawford interrupted. "And while the cat's away, the mice will ensure justice is served." He gestured to several of his men. "Take the prisoner." Deputy Collins had drawn his revolver, but he looked uncertainly at Daniels, awaiting orders. The sheriff knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Resistance might mean not only the prisoner's death, but their own as well. Before Daniels could decide on a course of action, a clear voice cut through the tension. "Stop right there." The crowd parted slightly, revealing Sarah Calloway standing at its edge, the blanket fallen away to expose the shotgun in her hands. She had positioned herself by the corner of the general store, giving her a clear view of both Crawford and Crewcone. The sheriff's wagon. A ripple of surprise moved through the mob. Women in Redemption Creek did not typically involve themselves in such matters, and certainly not armed with shotguns. Crawford recovered quickly from his surprise. "Mrs. Calloway, this is no place for a lady. I suggest you return home and leave this business to the men." Sarah stepped forward, her shotgun held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "This stopped being men's business the moment you decided to abandon the law in favor of murder, Mr. Crawford." She moved closer to the wagon, careful to keep Crawford and his closest supporters in her line of sight. "Sheriff Daniels is attempting to deliver a prisoner for a proper trial, as the law requires. Any man who interferes with that is committing a crime." Crawford's face darkened with anger. "Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore, Mrs. Calloway. Go home before you get hurt." "My husband taught me that the law protects us all, or it should," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He also taught me how to use this shotgun. Now I suggest you and your friends step aside and let justice take its proper course." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds, neither side willing to back down. In the wagon, Elijah watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. A white woman, a widow, from the sound of it, was putting herself at risk to protect him, a man she had never met. It defied everything he had experienced about how the world worked. Sheriff Daniels seized the moment of uncertainty to address the crowd. "Mrs. Calloway is right. Whatever your feelings about the accused, the law demands he receive a fair trial. I'm asking you all, as citizens of Texas, to respect that law." Crawford's laugh was harsh. "Fine words, Sheriff. But we all know what happens in these fair trials when bleeding hearts get involved. Technicalities, delays. Eventually, the guilty walk free." He pointed at Elijah. "This Negro killed Victor Hammond. Everyone knows it. Why waste time pretending otherwise?" "Everyone knows it?" Sarah challenged. Based on what evidence? What witnesses? Or is it simply convenient to blame the nearest black man rather than investigate properly? Her words struck a nerve with some in the crowd. A few men shifted uncomfortably, doubt beginning to creep into expressions that had been certain moments before. Crawford sensed he was losing momentum and decided to force the issue. Enough talk. Boys, take the prisoner. If the widow wants to play with her shotgun, she'll have to decide if she's really willing to shoot her neighbors. 5 men moved toward the wagon, determination in their stride. Sarah raised her shotgun, aiming directly at Crawford. I won't shoot my neighbors, Mr. Crawford. But you stopped being a neighbor the moment you decided to become a murderer. Her finger moved to the trigger. The first man who touches that wagon will answer to me. And unlike you, I don't make idle threats. The conviction in her voice brought the men to a halt. Even Crawford, for all his bluster, seemed unsure whether to call what he clearly perceived as a bluff. Into this tense tableau rode a new figure, Pastor Miller, his Bible clutched in one hand as he guided his horse through the crowd. Brothers, he called out, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a man accustomed to preaching without amplification. Consider what you're doing here today. Consider what this means for your souls. He dismounted, moving to stand near Sarah. The good book tells us, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say, unless you're really angry, or unless the victim is of a different race. It is an absolute commandment from the Almighty. Crawford sneered. Save your sermons for Sunday, Pastor. This is about justice, not religion. Is it? Miller questioned, opening his Bible. Because Proverbs reminds us, the Lord detests differing weights, and dishonest scales do not please him. When you apply one standard of justice to white men and another to black men, are you not using differing weights? Are you not employing dishonest scales in the eyes of God? His words landed heavily among the crowd, many of whom were regular churchgoers. Scripture carried weight in Redemption Creek, even among those who might selectively apply its teachings. Sarah seized the moment of uncertainty. Sheriff Daniels is doing his duty according to the law. Let him complete it. Let the prisoner have his day in court, as every man is entitled. Sheriff Daniels added his voice. Judge Porter will return from Austin tomorrow. The prisoner will be held securely until then. You have my word. Crawford, seeing control of the situation slipping away, made a desperate move. Words won't bring Victor Hammond back, he shouted. His blood cries out for vengeance. He lunged toward the wagon, grabbing for Elijah. Sarah's shotgun roared, the blast deliberately aimed over Crawford's head. The sound echoed off the buildings, around the square, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The next one won't miss, Mr. Crawford, Sarah stated, already reloading with practiced efficiency. Now back away from the wagon. Crawford froze, genuine fear crossing his face for the first time. He had not expected actual resistance to his plans, certainly not armed resistance from a widow woman. Taking advantage of the moment, Sheriff Daniels addressed the crowd again. I understand your anger. I understand your desire for justice. But this is not the way. Give the law a chance to work as it should. From the back of the wagon, Elijah finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. I didn't kill Victor Hammond. I argued with him, yes. He was beating a boy barely 12 years old for dropping a saddle. I told him to stop. We exchanged words. But when I left him, he was very much alive. Something in the simple dignity of his statement reached parts of the crowd that more forceful arguments had not. Here was not a desperate criminal, but a man maintaining his innocence in the face of death. A man willing to trust a legal system that had rarely shown fairness to people who looked like him. The mood of the crowd began to shift perceptibly. What had seemed like clear-cut justice minutes before now carried the troubling possibility of error. What if they hanged an innocent man? Michael Fletcher, the farmer Sarah had spoken with earlier, stepped forward. Maybe we should wait for Judge Porter, he suggested, not looking at Crawford. "Do this proper like." Others began to nod, the bloodthirsty unity of the mob fracturing in the face of doubt and the shotgun-backed moral stand before them. Crawford, seeing his control evaporating, made one last attempt. "This is weakness. Hammond deserves justice." "Justice isn't weak, Mr. Crawford," Sarah countered. "Lynch law is weak. It's the desperate act of men too afraid to trust the very legal system that protects their own rights and property." She lowered her shotgun slightly but kept it ready. "Be better than this. Be the men Redemption Creek needs, not the monsters it will be ashamed to remember." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and an opportunity. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Fletcher stepped back from the wagon. Another man followed, then another. The human barrier that had blocked the way to the jail began to dissolve as men returned to their businesses or homes, unwilling to be part of what now felt increasingly like a potential injustice. Crawford, his face twisted with fury and humiliation, found himself increasingly isolated. "You'll regret this," he spat at Sarah. "All of you will." "The only thing I would regret, Mr. Crawford, is standing by while an innocent man was murdered in the name of justice," Sarah replied evenly. "Now I believe Sheriff Daniels has a prisoner to deliver." With the way now clear, Daniels flicked the reins, and the wagon began to move toward the jail. Deputy Collins rode alongside, his hand still on his revolver, alert for any further trouble. As they passed Sarah, the sheriff tipped his hat in acknowledgement of what she had done. From the back of the wagon, Elijah's eyes met hers briefly, a look of gratitude so profound it needed no words to express. Sarah maintained her position until the wagon reached the jailhouse and Elijah was safely escorted inside. Only then did she lower her shotgun, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb, leaving her hands trembling slightly. Pastor Miller placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That was a brave thing you did, Mrs. Calloway. Thomas would have been proud." Sarah nodded, suddenly too emotional to speak. She had stood against the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of her community, the hatred, the fear, the casual disregard for black lives. She had won this battle, but she harbored no illusions that the war was over. Crawford and men like him would try again. The struggle for true justice would continue long after today's confrontation was forgotten. But for now, at least one innocent man would live to see his day in court. In Redemption Creek, on this day, that counted as victory. As the town square gradually emptied, Sarah Calloway walked slowly toward the jailhouse, her shotgun cradled in her arms, a woman who had discovered that courage, like justice, sometimes required more than words alone. Sheriff Marcus Daniels secured Elijah Freeman in the single cell at the Redemption Creek jail, removing his shackles only after the heavy iron door clanged shut. The small jailhouse was quiet now, the afternoon's near lynching having exhausted everyone involved. Through the barred window, Elijah could see the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the dusty street with golden light that belied the darkness that had nearly claimed his life. "You were lucky today," Sheriff Daniels remarked, hanging the cell keys on a hook behind his desk. "Not many men in your position get a reprieve like that." Elijah rubbed his wrists where the shackles had chafed the skin raw. "That woman with the shotgun, who is she?" "Sarah Calloway," the sheriff replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee from a pot that had been simmering too long on the small stove. "Widow of Judge Thomas Calloway. He was respected around these parts, fair-minded man, especially on matters of race. Died about 3 years back. And she just happened to be there with a shotgun when a lynch mob was forming?" Elijah asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Daniels shrugged. "Mrs. Calloway has a way of being exactly where justice needs defending. Been that way since the judge passed. Some folks say she's carrying on his work in her fashion." The sheriff hesitated, then added, "She took a considerable risk for you today." Crawford isn't the type to forget or forgive something like that. I didn't ask her to, Elijah said quietly. Don't even know the woman. Sometimes courage isn't about who you know, Daniels observed. It's about what you believe. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and grimaced. Get some rest, Freeman. Judge Porter returns tomorrow. You'll get your trial, for whatever that's worth. As the sheriff settled behind his desk to begin the evening's paperwork, Elijah lay down on the thin mattress that was his only comfort in the sparse cell. Despite his exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the lynch mob, heard Crawford's voice calling for his death. And behind those terrifying images was the unexpected vision of Sarah Calloway, standing firm with a shotgun against 30 angry men. It defied everything Elijah had learned about how the world worked. White women, in his experience, crossed the street to avoid being near a black man. They certainly didn't risk their lives to save one. What kind of woman would face down an entire town for a stranger? What kind of courage did that require? These questions followed Elijah into an uneasy sleep, where his dreams mixed memories of the day's terror with fragments of a childhood spent in the shadow of slavery and its aftermath. Across town, Sarah Calloway sat on her front porch, watching the same sunset that filtered through Elijah's cell window. Her shotgun rested against the wall beside her rocking chair, a silent reminder of the day's confrontation. She felt drained, the adrenaline of the standoff having left her system and taken most of her energy with it. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Sarah reached instinctively for the shotgun before recognizing Edward Mitchell, the young telegraph operator, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, hat in hand. "Mr. Mitchell," she acknowledged, relaxing her grip on the weapon. "What brings you out here at this hour?" The young man twisted his hat nervously. "Message came through for you, Mrs. Calloway, from Austin." He held out a yellow telegram form. "Thought you might want to see it right away, considering everything that happened today." Sarah took the telegram, unfolding it with a sense of foreboding. The message was brief but clear. Judge Porter detained in Austin. Stop legal matters require attention. Stop will not return for 1 week stop. She looked up at Mitchell, who was watching her reaction closely. "When did this arrive?" "About an hour ago," he admitted. "I would have brought it sooner, but you had to decide whether to deliver it at all." Sarah finished for him, understanding immediately. "Because this means there won't be a judge for the trial tomorrow." Mitchell nodded miserably. "Crawford came by the telegraph office after what happened in the square. He was asking about messages from Austin, specifically about Judge Porter. I didn't tell him anything, Mrs. Calloway, I swear it. But he seemed like he already knew something." Sarah's mind was working rapidly, fitting pieces together. Crawford has friends in Austin. Someone could have telegraphed him about the judge's delay before the official message was sent. She stood up, decision made. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Mr. Mitchell. You've shown real courage today." The young man blushed at the praise. "What will you do now, ma'am? When people find out there's no judge coming?" "Then we'll have to find another solution," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the worry gnawing at her. "The law doesn't disappear just because a judge is absent." After Mitchell left, Sarah paced her small parlor, the telegram clutched in her hand. Without Judge Porter, the fragile peace she had helped establish was in serious jeopardy. Daniels listened carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions, but raising no objections to the plan itself. "It's unorthodox," he admitted when she had finished. "But these are unorthodox times. I'll do my part." Sarah thanked him and left the jailhouse, her mind already turning to the next steps in her plan. The morning was advancing, and she had much to accomplish before noon if Elijah Freeman was to have any chance of survival. Her first stop was the telegraph office, where she sent several urgent messages to contacts Thomas had maintained during his time as judge. Next came visits to key members of the community. Pastor Miller, whose moral authority would be essential. Walter Graham, whose general store made him a hub of local information and influence. And surprisingly, Michael Fletcher, the farmer who had wavered during yesterday's confrontation. "I'm not promising anything, Mrs. Calloway," Fletcher warned, when she explained what she needed from him. "I respect what the judge stood for, and I respect you for standing up yesterday. But this town has certain expectations about how things are done." "Those expectations nearly led to murder yesterday, Mr. Fletcher," Sarah reminded him. "Is that the legacy you want for Redemption Creek? For your children to grow up knowing their father was part of a mob that hanged a man without trial?" Fletcher had no immediate answer for that, but he didn't refuse her request outright, which Sarah counted as a partial victory. She left his farm with a promise that he would consider her words, which was all she could reasonably hope for at this stage. Throughout the morning, Sarah was aware of being watched. Crawford's allies monitored her movements through town, no doubt reporting back on her activities. She made no attempt to hide her actions. Secrecy would only feed suspicion and potentially accelerate Crawford's plans for a lynching. By 11 o'clock, she had returned home to make her final preparations. She changed into her most formal dress, the one she had worn to Thomas's funeral, and pinned his old law license to her bodice. The document had no legal standing for what she intended, but it represented a connection to Thomas and the principles he had upheld throughout his career. As she prepared to leave for the courthouse, Sarah was surprised by a knock at her door. Opening it cautiously, she found Sheriff Daniels on her porch, his expression grave. "Crawford's gathered his men," he reported without preamble. "They're planning to take Freeman from the jail within the hour. My deputy's holding them off for now, but it won't last." Sarah felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach, but her voice remained steady. "Then we need to move more quickly than planned. Is the courthouse ready?" "As ready as it can be. But Mrs. Calloway, you should know, Crawford has been telling people you've lost your mind with grief over the judge. Says you're trying to play lawyer because you can't accept that Thomas is gone." Daniels looked uncomfortable sharing this information, but continued, "Some folks are listening to him. This could get ugly." "It's already ugly, Sheriff," Sarah replied, reaching for her shotgun. "The question is whether we allow that ugliness to destroy what little justice remains in Redemption Creek." Together they rode toward town, the midday sun casting harsh light over a landscape that seemed fraught with tension. As they approached the main street, Sarah could see a crowd gathering near the jailhouse, men with grim expressions and several with ropes coiled over their shoulders. At their center stood Hank Crawford, gesturing emphatically as he addressed his followers. "We need to move quickly," Daniels muttered, guiding their horses toward the courthouse on the opposite side of the street. "Get inside before they notice us." But it was too late for such subterfuge. Crawford spotted them, his speech faltering mid-sentence as he recognized Sarah beside the sheriff. "Well, well," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't the grieving widow, still playing at being a judge. Come to see real justice served, Mrs. Calloway?" Sarah did not respond to the taunt, keeping her eyes fixed on the courthouse ahead, but Crawford was not to be ignored. He stepped into the street, blocking their path, several of his most loyal supporters moving to flank him. "Step aside, Crawford," Sheriff Daniels ordered, his hand moving to rest on his holstered revolver. "Official business." "The only official business in Redemption Creek today is sending that murderer to meet his maker," Crawford retorted. "And no woman with a shotgun is going to stop us this time." He looked directly at Sarah, contempt written across his features. "Go home, Mrs. Calloway. This isn't a place for women or weak-hearted men who hide behind them." Sarah met his gaze. Steadily, "I'm going to the courthouse, Mr. Crawford, where the law of Texas will be upheld. You're welcome to attend, as is any citizen interested in justice rather than vengeance." Crawford laughed, the sound harsh in the tense atmosphere. Justice without a judge. You're more addled than I thought. Redemption Creek will have all the judicial authority it needs at noon, Sarah replied, her voice carrying to the edges of the gathering crowd. Anyone who interferes with these proceedings will answer to the law, not to a mob, not to sentiment, but to the written statutes of Texas. Something in her tone, the absolute conviction behind her words, created a moment of uncertainty, even among Crawford's supporters. She used that hesitation to urge her horse forward, forcing Crawford to step aside or be trampled. As they reached the courthouse steps, Sarah turned to address the crowd that had followed, curious about what she intended. Noon, she announced clearly. Justice will be served according to law, not lynch rope. All are welcome to witness. Inside the courthouse, Deputy Collins was already waiting with Elijah Freeman, who had been brought through a back entrance to avoid the gathering mob. The prisoner's shackles had been removed, though Collins kept a watchful eye on him, pistol at the ready. "Is everything prepared?" Sarah asked, surveying the courtroom. The space was modest, Redemption Creek being a small town, but it contained all the necessary elements: judge's bench, witness stand, jury box, and seating for spectators. "As you requested, Mrs. Calloway," Collins confirmed. "Though I still don't understand exactly what you're planning." "You will soon enough," Sarah assured him, moving to arrange her law books and documents on the judge's bench. "For now, I need you and the sheriff to ensure order when people begin arriving. No weapons in the courtroom, except for officers of the law." As noon approached, townspeople began filtering into the courthouse, some out of genuine interest in justice, others simply curious about what Sarah Calloway was attempting. Crawford arrived with his core supporters, taking seats near the front where they could make their disapproval known through glares and muttered comments. Pastor Miller entered with several church elders, nodding respectfully to Sarah before finding seats. Walter Graham from the general store brought his wife and grown son. To Sarah's surprise and relief, Michael Fletcher arrived with several other farmers, their expressions uncertain but not hostile. At precisely noon, Sheriff Daniels called the room to order, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the assembled crowd. "This court is now in session," he announced, using the formal language Sarah had provided him. "All rise." As the townspeople stood, many with confusion evident on their faces, Sarah Calloway walked deliberately to the judge's bench and took the seat that had once belonged to her husband. A collective gasp moved through the courtroom, followed by outraged mutterings from Crawford's section. "This is absurd," Crawford exclaimed, rising to his feet. "She has no authority to sit as judge." "Actually, Mr. Crawford, I do," Sarah replied calmly, opening a law book to a marked page. Under Texas Statute 1873, Section 15, Paragraph 3, in the absence of both a district judge and justice of the peace, judicial functions may be temporarily performed by a qualified citizen appointed by the sheriff as a special justice. She nodded to Sheriff Daniels, who produced an official-looking document and read aloud, "I, Marcus Daniels, Sheriff of Redemption County, being of sound mind and judgment, do hereby appoint Sarah Calloway as Special Justice pro tempore, with all powers and responsibilities thereunto pertaining, until such time as Judge Harlan Porter returns to resume his duties." Crawford's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is a mockery. A woman cannot serve as judge. It's against nature and law. The Texas statutes make no specification regarding gender for a special justice appointment, Mr. Crawford." Sarah countered, her voice leveled despite her racing heart. "If you wish to challenge my appointment, you are welcome to petition the Circuit Court in Austin. Until such challenge is successful, this court is in session." She turned to Deputy Collins, "Bring in the defendant." Elijah Freeman was escorted to the defendant's table, his bearing dignified despite the circumstances. He had been provided with clean clothes, nothing fancy, but presentable, another detail Sarah had arranged. "Elijah Freeman," Sarah addressed him formally, You stand accused of the murder of Victor Hammond. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Elijah replied clearly, using the honorific without hesitation. Sarah nodded, then addressed the room. "As this is a capital case, Texas law requires a jury trial. Sheriff Daniels has prepared a list of eligible citizens from which 12 jurors will be selected." Crawford jumped to his feet again. "We all know he's guilty. This charade only delays justice for Victor Hammond." "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said sharply, "you will maintain order in this court or be removed. The presumption of innocence is the foundation of our legal system. Mr. Freeman is entitled to a fair trial by a jury of his peers." "Peers?" Crawford scoffed. "He has no peers here. He's not even from this county. The law defines peers as fellow citizens, Mr. Crawford, not as individuals of identical background or origin." Sarah was in her element now, drawing on years of listening to Thomas discuss legal principles and studying his books after his death. "Now, if you have objections to the proceedings, you may raise them in an orderly fashion through proper legal channels. Otherwise, I must ask you to be seated." Crawford glared at her but returned to his seat, clearly recognizing that open defiance of even a self-appointed judge might undermine his standing with the more law-abiding citizens present. Sarah proceeded with jury selection, a process that took nearly an hour as potential jurors were questioned about their ability to be impartial. Crawford's supporters were systematically excluded when they admitted they had already determined Elijah's guilt, while several farmers and townspeople who expressed willingness to hear evidence were seated. By early afternoon, a jury had been impaneled, 12 men who, while not necessarily sympathetic to Elijah, had at least committed to considering the evidence before reaching a verdict. It was more than he could have hoped for 24 hours earlier when facing a lynch mob. As Sarah prepared to hear opening statements, she caught Elijah's eye across the courtroom. The black cowboy gave her a small nod of respect, one professional acknowledging another's skill. In that moment, despite the danger still surrounding them, Sarah felt a surge of pride in what they were accomplishing together. They were not just trying to save one man's life. They were fighting for the very idea that justice could transcend prejudice, that law could protect even those society deemed expendable. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since Judge Porter's delayed return had been announced, Sarah allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Sarah Calloway surveyed the courtroom from her position behind the judge's bench, acutely aware of the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders. The initial shock of her assuming judicial authority had settled into a tense anticipation. As the trial of Elijah Freeman prepared to move forward, outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Redemption Creek, a visual reminder that time was passing, time that Elijah might not have had without her. Intervention. "The court will now hear opening statements," Sarah announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sheriff Daniels will present the case against the defendant, as we have no formal prosecutor in attendance." Sheriff Daniels approached the space before the jury, looking uncomfortable in his role. He was a lawman, not a lawyer, but necessity had thrust him into this position, just as it had Sarah into hers. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "the facts in this case are straightforward. Victor Hammond was found dead in his barn on the morning of May 18th, his skull crushed by a shovel. The defendant, Elijah Freeman, had quarreled publicly with Hammond the previous day over Hammond's treatment of a stable boy. Witnesses heard Freeman threaten Hammond during this argument. Shortly after Hammond's body was discovered, Freeman was seen riding away from the area at high speed. Daniels paused, glancing at Sarah before continuing. Based on these facts, Freeman was arrested and charged with Hammond's murder. It will be your duty to determine whether the evidence supports this charge beyond a reasonable doubt. The sheriff's presentation was factual and devoid of inflammatory language, a stark contrast to what a prosecutor might have delivered, particularly given the racial element of the case. Sarah suspected this was intentional on Daniel's part. Another indication that the sheriff's commitment to justice might run deeper than she had initially realized. "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah said when he had finished. "Mr. Freeman, as you have no legal representation, you may present your opening statement, or you may waive this right and proceed directly to examination of witnesses." Elijah rose from his seat, his bearing dignified despite the circumstances. "Your Honor, I would like to make a statement." Sarah nodded, and Elijah turned to face the jury, 12 white men who held his life in their hands. The courtroom fell silent, even Crawford's supporters momentarily quelled by the gravity of the moment. "Gentlemen," Elijah began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the room, "I did not kill Victor Hammond. It's true that I argued with him the day before his death. I witnessed him beating a boy of 12 for a minor offense, and I spoke up against this cruelty. Words were exchanged, heated words on both sides. But when I left him, Hammond was very much alive." Elijah paused, his gaze moving steadily from face to face among the jurors. "I've been a cowboy for 15 years, working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. I've faced blizzards, stampedes, and rustlers. I've worked alongside men of every color and background. In all that time, I've never taken a human life, never struck a man except in self-defense." His voice took on a more personal tone. "I know how this looks. A black man accused of killing a white rancher. Most places I wouldn't have lived long enough to see a courtroom. But I stand before you today asking only what any man would ask, to be judged on evidence, not on fear or prejudice." Sarah was struck by Elijah's eloquence and restraint. There was no pleading in his statement, no desperate appeals to emotion, only a straightforward assertion of his innocence and a request for fair consideration. It was the speech of a man who understood his precarious position but refused to surrender his dignity, even with his life at stake. "Thank you, Mr. Freeman," Sarah said when he had finished. "The court will now hear testimony from witnesses. Sheriff Daniels, please call your first witness." The trial proceeded with a methodical thoroughness that Sarah had insisted upon. The first witnesses were those who had found Hammond's body, ranch hands who described the grim discovery in the early morning hours. Their testimony established the time of death between sunset and dawn, but offered no direct evidence linking Elijah to the crime. Next came witnesses who had observed the argument between Hammond and Elijah the day before the murder. Sarah noticed how differently the same event was characterized depending on the witness. Hammond's foreman described Elijah as threatening and menacing, while a young stable boy portrayed him as defending against Hammond's unprovoked cruelty. Throughout the testimony, Sarah maintained the impartial demeanor that Thomas had always displayed in court, allowing each witness to speak fully while ensuring the proceedings remained fair and orderly. When Crawford attempted to interrupt with outbursts, she silenced him with firm reminders of courtroom protocol, backed by Sheriff Daniels' authority to remove disruptive individuals. By late afternoon, the prosecution case had been fully presented. The evidence against Elijah was entirely circumstantial. No one had seen him commit the murder. No murder weapon had been found in his possession, and his only demonstrated connection to Hammond was their public argument. "The prosecution rests," Sheriff Daniels announced, returning to his seat with visible relief that his uncomfortable role was temporarily concluded. Sarah turned to Elijah. "Mr. Freeman, you may now present your defense. You may testify on your own behalf or call witnesses." Elijah stood. "I would like to testify, Your Honor." As Elijah took the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom intensified. For many in attendance, this was unprecedented. A black man testifying in his own defense in a murder trial, treated with the same procedural respect as any white witness. Crawford's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched with a mixture of curiosity and reluctant admiration for the dignity with which Elijah conducted himself. After being sworn in, Elijah provided a clear account of his movements on the day of Hammond's murder. He had been working at the neighboring Thornton Ranch, breaking horses for the new season. After completing his day's work, he had returned to the bunkhouse, eaten dinner with the other hands, and played cards until approximately 10 o'clock before retiring. "Did you leave the Thornton property at any time that night?" Sarah asked, guiding his testimony. "No, Your Honor. I was in the bunkhouse from dinner until sunrise the next morning." "Can anyone verify your presence there?" "Yes, there were 6 other men in the bunkhouse that night. 3 were still awake when I went to sleep," Sarah nodded. "And when did you learn of Hammond's death?" "The next morning." Word spread quickly. By noon, Sheriff Daniels had arrived to arrest me. Elijah's voice remained steady, without bitterness or accusation. "Why did you not resist arrest if you knew you were innocent?" Elijah's expression reflected a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. "A black man resisting a white sheriff rarely lives to explain his reasons, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this simple truth, uncomfortable but undeniable. Several jurors shifted in their seats, perhaps reconsidering their initial assumptions about the man before them. "One final question, Mr. Freeman," Sarah said. "Do you know who might have wanted Victor Hammond dead?" Before Elijah could answer, Crawford shot to his feet. "Objection! This is pure speculation." Sarah fixed him with a stern gaze. "Mr. Crawford, you are not an attorney in these proceedings. If you have objections, they must be presented through proper channels." She turned back to Elijah. "You may answer the question." Elijah nodded. Hammond had enemies. He wasn't well liked, even among other ranchers. He cheated his workers, seized water rights from smaller spreads, and had a reputation for violence when drunk. He hesitated, then added, there was talk that he was pressing unwanted attentions on Catherine Thornton, his neighbor's daughter. Mr. Thornton was known to be furious about it. Crawford could contain himself no longer. "This is outrageous. He's accusing respected white citizens to save his own skin." "Order!" Sarah commanded, striking the gavel Thomas had once used. "Mr. Crawford, this is your final warning. One more outburst and you will be removed from this courtroom." Crawford subsided, but his expression promised retribution beyond the confines of the legal proceedings. Sarah remained outwardly composed, though inwardly she recognized the danger was mounting. Crawford wouldn't forget this perceived humiliation, and his influence in Redemption Creek extended beyond the courtroom. "Mr. Freeman, do you have any witnesses to call in your defense?" Sarah asked, returning to the matter at hand. "Yes, Your Honor. I would call Jacob Miller, one of the hands from the Thornton Ranch who was with me the night of the murder." A young man rose from the spectator seats, white, barely 20, with the weathered complexion of someone who worked outdoors. He approached the witness stand nervously, casting apologetic glances toward Crawford and his supporters. After being sworn in, Jacob confirmed Elijah's account. "He was in the bunkhouse all night, ma'am. I mean, Your Honor. We played cards until about 10, and he was in his bunk when I turned in around midnight. Still there when we all got up at dawn." "Could he have left during the night without your knowledge?" Sarah asked. Jacob shook his head. "Not likely. The bunkhouse door squeaks something fierce, and I'm a light sleeper. Plus, Elijah's bunk was right by the door. I'd have noticed if he'd gotten up." Crawford leaned over to whisper something to one of his associates, who nodded and slipped out of the courtroom. The action wasn't lost on Sarah, who felt a growing sense of unease. Whatever Crawford was planning, it likely didn't bode well for the proceedings. The defense called 2 more witnesses, another ranch hand who corroborated Jacob's testimony. And surprisingly, the young stable boy Hammond had been beating when Elijah intervened. The boy, no more than 12 and visibly terrified to be testifying, nevertheless provided a compelling account of Hammond's cruelty and Elijah's intervention. "Mr. Freeman didn't threaten to kill Mr. Hammond," the boy insisted. "He just said he should be ashamed treating a child that way, and that men who abuse those weaker than themselves often meet bad ends." "And how did Mr. Hammond respond?" Sarah asked gently. The boy swallowed hard. He laughed. "Said no uppity Negro was going to tell him how to handle his property. Then he went for his whip, but Mr. Freeman stepped between us." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Mr. Hammond would have whipped me bloody if Mr. Freeman hadn't been there." As the boys stepped down from the witness stand, a commotion could be heard outside the courthouse. Sheriff Daniels moved to the window, his expression darkening at whatever he observed. "Your Honor," he said quietly, approaching the bench, "there's a crowd gathering. Looks like Crawford's associates have been busy while we've been in session." Sarah maintained her composure with effort. "How many?" "At least 30 men, some armed. They don't look inclined to respect the court's proceedings." Sarah considered her options. The trial was proceeding well from a legal standpoint. The evidence against Elijah was weak, and his alibi appeared solid. But none of that would matter if a mob stormed the courthouse before a verdict could be reached. "We'll continue," she decided. "Mr. Freeman, have you completed your defense?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then we will hear closing arguments." "Sheriff Daniels, please proceed." The sheriff's closing argument was brief and factual, summarizing the evidence without pressing strongly for conviction, another indication of his personal doubts about Elijah's guilt. Elijah's own closing statement reiterated his innocence and thanked the jury for their consideration, regardless of their ultimate decision. As Sarah prepared to give instructions to the jury, the noise outside grew louder, angry voices, the occasional shout demanding justice for Hammond. The courthouse doors suddenly burst open, and Crawford's associate who had left earlier returned, followed by a disheveled man Sarah recognized as Tom Wilson, another of Hammond's ranch hands. "Your Honor," Crawford called out, rising from his seat with newfound confidence, "we have a new witness who can prove Freeman's guilt." Sarah hesitated. Proper procedure would allow for additional testimony only under exceptional circumstances, but refusing might provide Crawford with the pretext he needed to incite the crowd outside to action. "The court will hear this witness," she decided. "But I caution him that perjury is a serious offense punishable by imprisonment." Wilson took the stand, the smell of whiskey evident even from where Sarah sat. He was sworn in, swaying slightly as he repeated the oath. "Tell the court what you saw the night Hammond was killed," Crawford prompted before Sarah could ask a proper question. "I saw him," Wilson slurred, pointing unsteadily at Elijah. "Saw him sneaking into Hammond's barn around midnight. Had something in his hand, couldn't see what. But I heard Hammond yell, and then nothing." "And why are you only coming forward now?" Sarah asked, her skepticism evident. Wilson looked momentarily confused, then rallied. "Was scared, wasn't I? Figured he might come after me next if I talked." Sarah turned to Elijah. "Mr. Freeman, do you wish to question this witness?" Elijah stood, his expression showing not anger but a weary recognition of the familiar pattern unfolding. "Mr. Wilson, you claim you saw me at Hammond's barn at midnight on the night of the murder?" "That's right," Wilson affirmed, a hint of belligerence entering his voice. "And where exactly were you when you allegedly saw this?" Wilson hesitated, looking toward Crawford for guidance. "By the corral. I was checking on a sick horse." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "A sick horse. I see. And the night of May 18th, was it clear or cloudy, do you recall?" The question seemed to confuse Wilson. "Clear, I reckon. Could see pretty good." "That's interesting," Elijah replied calmly, "because I distinctly remember it was pouring rain that night. So hard that the Thornton ranch hands were worried about flooding in the lower pastures. Isn't that right, Jacob?" From the spectator seats, Jacob Miller nodded emphatically. "Yes, sir, rained something fierce all night. Had to move the horses to higher ground around 11. Wilson's face flushed. "Maybe it was the night before then. I don't rightly remember exactly." "So you're not certain of the date when you claim to have seen me?" Elijah pressed. "I know what I saw." Wilson insisted, but his credibility was already crumbling. A black man at the barn had to be him. Elijah turned to Sarah. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness." Wilson was dismissed, stumbling slightly as he left the stand. Crawford's gambit had backfired, the obviously false testimony had only strengthened the impression of Elijah's innocence rather than undermining it. But outside, the crowd continued to grow. Sarah could hear their voices becoming more unified, more threatening. She needed to conclude the trial quickly if justice was to have any chance of prevailing against mob sentiment. "Gentlemen of the jury," she addressed the 12 men who had listened attentively throughout the proceedings. "You have heard the evidence both for and against the defendant. It is now your responsibility to deliberate and render a verdict based solely on that evidence, not on prejudice or public opinion." She provided careful instructions on the legal standard of reasonable doubt, emphasizing that Elijah must be presumed innocent unless the evidence convinced them otherwise. "Remember that a man's life hangs in the balance," she concluded. "Your verdict must reflect the truth as you have discerned it from the testimony presented." The jury filed out to begin their deliberations, and Sarah called a recess. Sheriff Daniels approached the bench immediately, his expression grave. "Mrs. Calloway, the situation outside is deteriorating. Crawford's been working that crowd into a frenzy. I'm not sure how long Deputy Collins and I can hold them back if they decide to rush the courthouse." Sarah nodded, having expected this development. "How long do we have?" "An hour, maybe less," Daniels estimated. "Unless something changes the dynamic out there." Sarah thought quickly. "Is there a back entrance where we could move the defendant if necessary?" "Yes, but they'd likely spot us." Crawford's positioned men around the building. The situation was becoming desperate. Even if the jury acquitted Elijah, which seemed increasingly likely given the evidence, Crawford's mob might simply take matters into their own hands once he left the courthouse. Sarah was about to respond when Pastor Miller approached, his Bible clutched in one hand. "Mrs. Calloway, Sheriff, I believe I might be able to help with the crowd outside." "How so, Pastor?" Sarah asked. "Many of those men attend my church," Miller explained. "They respect spiritual authority, even when other forms of authority are being questioned. If I could address them, remind them of their Christian duty to respect the law and avoid violence." Sarah exchanged a glance with Sheriff Daniels. It wasn't much of a plan, but it might buy them the time needed for the jury to reach a verdict. "It's worth trying," she decided. "But be careful, Pastor. Mob mentality can overwhelm even religious conviction." As Miller left to address the crowd, Sarah turned her attention to Elijah, who sat calmly at the defendant's table despite the growing danger. "Mr. Freeman," she said quietly, "I want to prepare you for all possibilities. If the verdict is not in your favor, or if the situation outside becomes unmanageable before the jury returns, Sheriff Daniels has a plan to remove you through a back entrance." Elijah met her gaze steadily. "And if we're seen?" Sarah couldn't bring herself to lie to him. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." A hint of a smile touched Elijah's lips. "You've already done more than anyone could have expected, Mrs. Calloway. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from outside. Not the angry shouts of before, but a different kind of disturbance. Sheriff Daniels hurried to the window, then turned back with an expression of disbelief. "Mrs. Calloway, you're not going to believe this. There's a wagon coming down the main street, and it's carrying Victor Hammond's foreman, James Tucker, in handcuffs." Sarah rose from the bench, momentarily abandoning judicial protocol in her surprise. "What? Who's bringing him in?" "Texas Rangers, by the look of it. 2 of them, escorting the wagon." The courthouse doors opened, and a tall figure in the distinctive gear of a Texas Ranger entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Behind him, 2 deputies brought in a sullen James Tucker, his hands cuffed before him, Begging the court's pardon for the interruption, the ranger announced. Approaching the bench, Captain Robert Hayes, Texas Rangers. I understand you're conducting a murder trial here. Sarah resumed her seat, maintaining the authority of her position despite the unprecedented interruption. That's correct, Captain. Elijah Freeman stands accused of the murder of Victor Hammond. May I ask why you've brought Mr. Tucker into my courtroom? Hayes gestured for his deputies to bring Tucker forward. Because James Tucker has confessed to Hammond's murder, Your Honor. We apprehended him trying to flee across the state line into Oklahoma territory. A wave of exclamation swept through the courtroom. Crawford half rose from his seat, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, but for once he seemed at a loss for words. Explain yourself, Captain, Sarah directed, fighting to maintain her judicial composure in the face of this extraordinary development. Hayes nodded. My men and I were investigating a series of cattle thefts along the Texas-Oklahoma border. Our evidence led us to suspect Hammond's ranch was involved in moving stolen cattle. While questioning ranch hands at neighboring spreads, we learned Tucker had suddenly departed after Hammond's death, taking a substantial amount of money with him. The ranger produced a blood-stained shirt from a saddlebag. We caught up with Tucker near the Red River. When confronted with evidence linking him to the thefts, he broke down and admitted he'd killed Hammond after a dispute over their rustling operation. Hammond had been threatening to expose Tucker to save himself if authorities closed in. Tucker kept his gaze fixed on the floor, offering no denial of the ranger's account. The murder weapon? Sarah asked. A shovel from Hammond's own barn, wiped clean and replaced after the deed. Tucker described the location exactly as the initial report stated. Hayes handed Sarah a written confession. He's prepared to plead guilty to both the murder and the cattle rustling charges. Sarah examined the document, which appeared properly executed and witnessed. Outside, she could hear Pastor Miller's voice addressing the crowd, apparently unaware of the dramatic developments inside the courthouse. Captain Hayes, she said finally, your timing is fortuitous. The jury in Mr. Freeman's trial has not yet returned a verdict. She turned to Sheriff Daniels. Sheriff, please recall the jury. They need to be informed of this new evidence. When the jurors returned and were apprised of Tucker's confession, their relief was palpable. Several nodded to Elijah, tacit acknowledgement that they had already been leaning toward acquittal even before this revelation. In light of this new evidence and the confession of James Tucker, Sarah announced, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Elijah Freeman. Mr. Freeman, you are free to go. The words felt almost inadequate given what Elijah had endured, but they carried the full weight of the law, a law that, despite all obstacles, had eventually found its way to truth. Outside, the mood of the crowd had transformed with the news of Tucker's confession. Many drifted away, embarrassed by their earlier bloodlust in light of Elijah's proven innocence. Crawford and his closest allies remained, glaring at Sarah with undisguised hatred, but the presence of Texas Rangers neutralized any immediate threat they might have posed. As the courthouse emptied, Sarah found herself face to face with Elijah Freeman. For a moment, neither spoke, the magnitude of what they had just survived rendering words insufficient. Finally, Elijah extended his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Calloway, not just for my life, but for showing that the law can work even for someone like me. Sarah took his hand without hesitation. The law should work for everyone, Mr. Freeman. That's what my husband believed, and what I believe. Elijah nodded, understanding the depth of principle that had driven her actions. What will you do now? Crawford and his kind won't forget this. No, they won't, Sarah agreed, glancing toward the courthouse doors where Crawford could still be seen conferring with his supporters. But neither will others who saw justice prevail today. Sometimes that's how change begins, not with grand gestures, but with individual acts of courage that remind people of their better natures. As the sun began to set over Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Sarah Calloway walked alongside Elijah Freeman, the widow who had risked everything for justice, and the innocent man she had saved. Behind them, the legal system that had nearly failed had been redeemed, not by abstract principles, but by the determined actions of those who refused to surrender to prejudice and fear. In a town aptly named Redemption Creek, something profound had changed that day. Not everything, not for everyone, but enough to create a ripple that would spread outward in ways no one could yet imagine. 3 weeks after the trial that had nearly cost Elijah Freeman his life, Sarah Calloway stood on her front porch, watching the afternoon sun cast golden light across her fields. The summer heat had settled over Redemption Creek like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the rhythms of rural life: farmers tending crops, ranchers moving cattle to fresh pasture, the town settling into a quiet routine that belied the dramatic events of the previous month. But beneath this peaceful surface, Sarah knew that Redemption Creek had changed. The town had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, race, and the ease with which good people could be led toward terrible acts in the name of righteousness. Some had emerged from this reckoning with expanded perspectives. Others had retreated further into resentment and prejudice. A rider approached her property from the direction of town, and Sarah recognized Edward Mitchell, the telegraph operator, who had become something of a regular visitor since the trial. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," Mitchell called, dismounting at her gate. "Brought your mail and a telegram that came through this morning." Sarah invited him onto the porch and offered a glass of cold lemonade, which he accepted gratefully. "Any news from town today?" she asked, sorting through the mail he had delivered. Mitchell took a long drink before answering. "Crawford's been meeting with his supporters at the saloon again. Closed-door talks, but word is he's planning something." He hesitated, then added, "There's talk they might try to run you off your land, ma'am." Sarah wasn't surprised. Hank Crawford's humiliation at the trial had only intensified his animosity toward her. The cattle broker had substantial influence in the county and wasn't known for forgetting perceived slights. "Let them talk, Mr. Mitchell," she replied calmly. "This land has been in Thomas's family for 3 generations. I'm not easily frightened away." Mitchell looked uncomfortable. "It might be more than talk this time, Mrs. Calloway. Crawford's brought in some rough men from over in Dry Gulch, not the sort who ask polite questions before taking action." Sarah appreciated his concern, but refused to show the unease his words provoked. "Thank you for the warning. I'll be careful." After Mitchell departed, Sarah opened the telegram he had delivered. It was from Captain Hayes of the Texas Rangers, responding to an inquiry she had sent the previous week. "Investigation proceeding. Stop evidence. Suggests Hammond-Rustling operation. Extensive Stop Crawford connection being examined. Stop recommend caution until completed. Stop will visit when possible. Stop Hayes." Sarah read the message twice, considering its implications. Her suspicions about Crawford's possible involvement in Hammond's illegal activities might have merit, which would explain the cattle broker's desperate eagerness to see Elijah Freeman hanged before the truth emerged. If the Rangers could prove a connection, Crawford's influence in Redemption Creek would be shattered. But until that happened, she was increasingly vulnerable. The trial had cost her many of the social connections that had protected her as Judge Calloway's widow. Former friends now avoided her on the street. Invitations to social gatherings had ceased. Even at church, she found herself sitting alone while others whispered behind their hands. Sarah was contemplating these challenges when she heard another horse approaching, this one moving at a faster pace than Mitchell's leisurely ride. She stepped back into the house long enough to retrieve her shotgun before returning to the porch. The rider who emerged from the tree line wasn't one of Crawford's hired thugs, however. It was Elijah Freeman, sitting tall in the saddle of a handsome chestnut gelding. He slowed as he approached her gate, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Mrs. Calloway," he called, maintaining a cautious distance that acknowledged the proprieties of a black man visiting a white woman's home. "Alone. May I speak with you?" Sarah set aside the shotgun and walked down to the gate. "Mr. Freeman, this is a surprise." "I apologize for coming unannounced," Elijah said, remaining mounted. "I'd heard there might be trouble brewing for you because of the trial. Thought you should know I'm leaving the territory tomorrow. Heading north to Wyoming, where I've got work waiting with a cattle outfit." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of regret at this news. Though they had spoken little since the trial's conclusion, Elijah's presence in the county had represented a tangible reminder that justice had prevailed. His departure would leave her more isolated in the struggle that clearly lay ahead. "That's probably wise," she acknowledged. "There's little future for you here after everything that's happened." Elijah nodded. "I came to thank you again for what you did. Not many would have risked what you risked for a stranger, especially not a black stranger." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small wooden box. "I wanted you to have this. It's not much, but where I'm going, I won't need it anymore." Sarah accepted the box, opening it to find a silver pocket watch, old but well-maintained, its case engraved with an intricate pattern of oak leaves. "It belonged to my father," Elijah explained. "One of the few possessions he managed to keep after emancipation. He taught me that time is the one thing that treats all men equally. Doesn't matter if you're black or white, rich or poor. We all get the same hours in a day. What matters is how we use them." He paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "You used yours to save my life, Mrs. Calloway. I won't forget that." Sarah was deeply moved by the gift and its significance. "I can't accept something so personal, Mr. Freeman. This should stay in your family." "I have no family left," Elijah replied simply. "No children to pass it to. And I'd rather it go to someone who understands its value than be stolen from my body when my time comes." His expression softened slightly. "Please, it would mean a great deal to know my father's watch is with someone who stood for the same principles he believed in." Unable to refuse such a request, Sarah nodded her acceptance. "I'll treasure it, Mr. Freeman, and I'll remember what you said about how we use our time." Elijah settled his hat back on his head, preparing to depart. "Be careful, Mrs. Calloway. Crawford isn't the type to let go of a grudge, and you've wounded his pride more than once." "I'll be careful," she assured him. "And you have a safe journey to Wyoming. Perhaps you'll find what you're looking for there." "What I'm looking for," Elijah echoed thoughtfully. "You know, that's changed recently. Used to think all I wanted was to be left alone, to find some quiet corner where I wouldn't have to worry about being judged for the color of my skin." He gazed toward the distant horizon. "But after what happened here, after seeing one person stand against a whole town because it was right, I'm starting to think maybe there's more I should be doing with my time." With those words and a respectful tip of his hat, Elijah turned his horse and rode away, soon disappearing into the same tree line from which he had emerged. Sarah watched until he was out of sight, the silver watch cool and heavy in her palm, a tangible connection to a man whose courage had matched her own during those terrible days of the trial. That evening, as darkness settled over her farm, Sarah sat at her kitchen table studying Thomas's law books by lamplight. The encounter with Elijah had strengthened her resolve to continue what she had begun during the trial. Redemption Creek needed more than a single act of justice. It needed sustained commitment to the principles that justice represented. Her concentration was broken by the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving quickly and without the casual rhythm of social visitors. Sarah extinguished her lamp and moved to the window, peering cautiously into the darkness. 4 mounted figures had stopped at her gate. Even in the dim moonlight, she could make out rifles in their hands and bandanas covering the lower portions of their faces. Crawford's men had come sooner than she had anticipated. Sarah retrieved her shotgun and moved quickly to the back door. She had prepared for this possibility, establishing a route to the small spring house 50 yards behind the main building. The stone structure was solid, with only one entrance and thick walls that could withstand gunfire, a defensive position, where she could hold out if necessary. But as she slipped quietly into the darkness of her backyard, Sarah realized the riders had anticipated this move. 2 mounted figures were already positioned between the house and the spring house, effectively cutting off her escape route. "Evening, Mrs. Calloway," called a voice she recognized as belonging to Jim Harris, one of Crawford's most loyal supporters. "Seems like you and Mr. Crawford need to have a conversation about the future of this property." Sarah stood her ground. "Shotgun ready. Mr. Crawford is welcome to call during daylight hours if he wishes to discuss business. Nighttime visits from masked men suggest intentions that aren't business-related." A harsh laugh came from one of the other riders. "Sharp tongue on the widow. No wonder Judge Calloway died young. Probably talked him into an early grave." "State your purpose or leave my property," Sarah demanded, ignoring the taunt. "Either way, I won't be intimidated." Harris dismounted, keeping his rifle trained in her general direction. "It's simple, Mrs. Calloway. Your interference in county matters has become a problem. Mr. Crawford feels it would be best for everyone if you sold your farm and moved somewhere more suited to a woman of your independent nature." "And if I decline this generous suggestion?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then accidents happen," Harris replied bluntly. "Barns catch fire. Cattle wander off. Sometimes houses burn with their owners inside. Tragic, but not uncommon. On the frontier." Sarah had expected threats, but the coldness with which they were delivered still chilled her. These men had moved beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. They were prepared to commit murder to serve Crawford's interests and protect themselves from the consequences of their association with Hammond's rustling operation. "I'll give you until Saturday to decide," Harris continued. "Crawford's offering fair market value for the land. Take it and leave, Mrs. Calloway. There's nothing for you here anymore." Before Sarah could respond, the distant sound of approaching riders caused the 4 men to tense. Harris swore under his breath. "We've got company. Mount up." The men scrambled back to their horses, clearly unwilling to be caught in their nighttime intimidation mission. As they galloped away toward the south pasture, Sarah remained where she stood, shotgun ready, uncertain whether the approaching riders represented rescue or additional threat. Minutes later, 3 riders came into view on the road from town. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized Sheriff Daniels, Deputy Collins, and to her surprise, Pastor Miller. "Mrs. Calloway," Daniels called as they reached her gate. "You all right? Mitchell came to town saying he was worried about threats against you." Sarah lowered her shotgun, relief washing over her. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Though you just missed some uninvited guests, Crawford's men, making it clear I should sell my farm and leave the county." Daniels dismounted, his expression darkening. "Damnation. I was afraid it might come to this." He glanced at the other men. "Pastor rode with us because he's heard things during church visits that concerned him." Pastor Miller nodded gravely. "Crawford's been gathering support, Mrs. Calloway. Not just the usual rough elements, but respected farmers and businessmen. He's convincing them that your actions during the trial undermine the natural order of things, that allowing a black man to question white witnesses sets a dangerous precedent." When Sarah returned to her farm, she found an unexpected visitor waiting, Captain Hayes of the Texas Rangers, his horse tethered to her front gate. "Mrs. Calloway," he greeted her, rising from his seat on her porch steps. "Got your telegram. Thought this warranted a personal visit rather than a written response." Sarah invited him inside, where Hayes wasted no time getting to the point. "Your information about Crawford's connection to Hammond's rustling operation matches our developing Evidence. We believe Crawford has been using his cattle brokerage business to move stolen livestock through legitimate channels for years. Can you arrest him? Sarah asked, hope rising despite her efforts to temper it. Hayes frowned. Not yet. We're close, but we need more concrete evidence linking him directly to the operation. Right now, he could claim he was an unwitting middleman, buying cattle he believed were legitimate. Sarah shared what had happened the previous night, Crawford's men threatening her on her own property, and the confrontation in town that afternoon. Hayes listened with growing concern. This changes things. Threatening a witness in an ongoing investigation is something we can act on. He considered for a moment. The community forum you're planning, when is it scheduled? 3 days from now, Sarah replied. Sunday afternoon, after church services. Pastor Miller thought more people would attend if it didn't require a special trip into town. Good thinking, Hayes nodded. I'd like to attend, if that's acceptable. Not to speak, necessarily, but to observe, and perhaps to ensure things remain civil. Sarah welcomed his offer, recognizing the additional legitimacy his presence would lend to the proceedings. As they continued discussing the details, a sense of cautious optimism began to replace the fear that had been her constant companion since the trial. Crawford's power wasn't absolute. It depended on silence, isolation, and the reluctance of good people to stand against him. By breaking that silence, by creating connections between like-minded citizens, Sarah had begun to forge a counter-narrative to Crawford's vision of Redemption Creek. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt fully engaged with her community, not as a widow to be pitied or a troublemaker to be avoided, but as a citizen with a voice and a vision for justice that extended beyond legal proceedings. As Captain Hayes prepared to depart, promising to return for the forum, he paused on her porch steps. Judge Calloway was respected throughout the territory, he said unexpectedly. Not just for his legal knowledge, but for his character. He believed the law existed to lift people up, not to hold them down. Hayes settled his hat on his head. From what I've seen, Mrs. Calloway, that belief didn't die with him. Sarah watched the ranger ride away, his words echoing in her mind. Thomas's beliefs hadn't died because she had kept them alive, not as abstract principles in dusty law books, but as active forces shaping the world around her. And in doing so, she had discovered strengths within herself that widowhood and isolation had obscured but never erased. The sun was setting over Redemption Creek, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. Sarah took Elijah's silver watch from her pocket, its weight a reminder of connections that transcended society's boundaries. Whatever happened in the days ahead, whether Crawford prevailed or justice found its voice, she would not regret the path she had chosen. Some fights were worth having, even when victory wasn't guaranteed. Some principles were worth defending, even at personal cost. In standing for these truths, Sarah Calloway had found not just purpose, but a kind of freedom that no threat could diminish. The freedom that comes from aligning one's actions with one's deepest convictions, whatever the world might say. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.